Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your host for today, and today we are talking about Brave New World. We've been talking about it the last couple of weeks, and we are through, I want to say chapter 6 now. I know it seems like a big jump to go from chapters 1 and then chapters 2 and 3 to chapters 4, 5, and 6. So, yeah, there's just been a lot more, I guess, plot, for lack of another word. This book seems to have kind of a disjointed introduction, for lack of another word, say the same thing like 5 times in a row. This book kind of has a disjointed introduction. A lot of the exposition in the beginning of the book is kind of like preparing you as the reader to understand where it is that the main characters are coming from in order to understand better where it is that they're going. The primary premise of the book hasn't really been like revealed yet necessarily. I guess the primary conflict, a lot of it has just been like, these are statements about the world that exist. So it's a lot of world building. And as I talked about ad nauseum in the first chapter, one of the primary aspect, or the big thing about this world, the primary aspect of this world, in my opinion, is that human beings no longer reproduce organically, and the collective is prioritized above the individual. So individuals aren't really allowed to have a self outside of the self within the group. And so one of the things that they reference pretty frequently is this idea that everybody belongs to everybody. And that kind of seems to be one of their mantras, if you will. To like, I guess, make the world a better place for them. I'm not entirely sure. Everyone belongs to everyone is just kind of like an affirmation to the fact that nobody's allowed to have like a personal identity. And so like the way that the group collective is viewed as a collection of individuals, but also a collection of those individuals' mental states. And to that end, there's been an introduction of a drug into the storyline that the primary two characters, who seem to be Helena and Bernard Marx, the two of them kind of seem to be like our main characters, even though we've seen like the director, another guy who was giving a tour of the facility, Helena's friend, as well as Henry has made an appearance, and Henry is, I believe, the person who Helena was seeing before she saw Bernard. Though, if, like I mentioned earlier and I mentioned last episode, there really is no such thing as like monogamy in this particular world. Like everything is polygamous, not just in the sense of like human relationships, but in romantic relationships, but in the human sense of relationships. So like, you know, people don't have special friendships or anything. Like everyone belongs to everyone, which is interesting, because it doesn't seem to me like Huxley does a really good job of like actually keeping that or allowing that to be true. There's still certain instances in the text where it feels like there's like favoritism and things like that that are being shown, but people just kind of like fight through it. And I don't know if that's Huxley trying to say like, oh yeah, no, you could try to say that everyone belongs to everyone and that like, you know, everyone looks as close to the same as possible, but like people are still going to nitpick and find little judgments here and there about other individuals to have thoughts on. So I think that it's interesting that he mentions that specifically because like as we're going through kind of like the social interactions that people have throughout these first few chapters, it's very frequent that one of the characters will pause and critique the physical appearance of another character during a really interesting scene. I guess, I don't know if I'd call it a scene. Talking about this book is difficult to do in the first few chapters because it's bouncing around so much between different instances of, like, event. So one paragraph you are taking a tour, and the next paragraph you're listening to another individual in a different place going through some sort of, like, ritual or something like that. It's very odd. Huxley does a really good job of kind of presenting this world as being very like disconcerting and disjointed, and I think that that's good, ? Not really totally sure how I feel about the way that the book has gone. The first couple chapters were just phenomenal world building, and so for us to kind of be like bouncing around all over the place now just feels a little bit less satisfying overall than the first chapter. But I think that there's still plenty to talk about. I mean, I know there's still plenty to talk about and plenty of plot to happen. So, of course, you know, I'm more just trying to like set my expectations realistically rather than be pessimistic necessarily. On that note, let's kind of get back to, I guess, the plot of what's happened in the last couple chapters, because that's important to talk about because that is a big part of things to discuss. So, the last place that we left off, there was kind of like there'd been like one social gathering. I guess a lot of these chapters leading up to the primary conflict are kind of just like weird little social events that have larger implications about the world. So the drug that gets introduced is called Soma, and there is this idea that is held by individuals that, well, I just said the word that so many times within such a short period of time. The purpose of the drug is to basically regulate emotions in a way to where you're like exclusively happy would be the best way I could possibly describe it. Not entirely sure exactly what it is that it does, whether it's like an antidepressant or something along those lines. But overall, it's just a drug that alters the consciousness of the individual who is doing it. And it's kind of viewed as like a prescription in some ways. And whenever you start to get distracted by like overthinking or, I mean, even participating in the idea of a self, you're supposed to take the Soma so that you can kind of like collectively join in with everybody who is enjoying themselves, I guess, for lack of another word. And part of the reason that you do this is because there's this general belief that has been kind of indoctrinated into people that like when you suffer, the group suffers. And so if you are struggling with like feelings of melancholy, depression, or questioning things or anything like that, then like the whole group is suffering because of you. And so like you have a responsibility to the group to like behave, to fall in line, and to do, you know, how the rest of the group does so that you can all be united as one, I guess entity would be the best word to use for that particular application. And to this effect, there are kind of like a bunch of these pithy little catchphrases that Helena knows and is quoting at Bernard like consistently throughout throughout the first couple chapters of the book, because Helena and Bernard are kind of, I think they become kind of the main characters. I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, we're only 6 chapters in. But Helena and Bernard, they meet at one of these social events after Helena's friend tells Helena to stop seeing just Henry because she can have anyone who she wants. And then she meets up with Bernard and they decide to like start hanging out. They end up sleeping together because that's like not a big deal in this particular context. They call it having one another, as in like I'm having so-and-so for dinner. Kind of like it's supposed to just be as casual as possible when it comes to like acts of intimacy and things like that. So that is definitely odd in some sense because, I mean, obviously it's just substantially different from what we experience on a regular basis. So that's part of the tool set that's being used to manipulate people into like not having like individuality, because you don't have individual relationships. Your relationship is with everybody. And during this first kind of like soiree that Helena and Bernard have, we kind of get a glimpse into what's going on with Bernard. He's kind of in this position where he generally is viewed as being like a higher up. I think he's an alpha technically. And he's viewed as being this higher up individual who is successful and people like him and he's well known. But in reality, he's kind of very odd because he actually wants to experience a lot of human emotion and a lot of individuality. He makes specific mention of the fact that he doesn't like being in large groups of people to Helena on their during their first encounter. He specifically says something along the lines of like, I want to go somewhere and be alone. And she says, why would we want to be alone? You know, and then they go somewhere and they are alone and she turns the radio on and he says, oh, I can't stand that noise, because he kind of is just looking for some form of, I guess, like intimacy or connection would be the best way that I could describe it. I'm not entirely sure exactly how it is that Huxley is hoping for us to interpret that, but I'm thinking that generally, the idea is that Bert Marx is, did I say Bert? Brad? Why am I forgetting his name all of a sudden? I just said it. Bernard. There we go. Gosh darn it. Yeah, that Bernard is kind of like counterculture to the culture that he's surrounded by, because he is looking for something that is like ultimately very human and satisfying in the world. Like he even makes mention later in the book that there's part of him that hopes that he goes through some sort of like great trial and doesn't have access to any of the trappings of the futuristic world that he lives in, because he's really hopeful, or he just wants to experience something real. And that's kind of generally the vibe that I get off of that character, is that he's looking for something that's going to be like really satisfying, because he feels unsatisfied and listless in the things that he does, because they feel so purposeless, because they're just a part of like some machine that never stops turning, and never pauses to realize like who it's killed in its wake. And so Bernard seems to kind of be one of the only people who is somewhat aware of the fact that he's not necessarily happy. It seems like anybody else, when they become unhappy, just turns straight to soma or a social gathering or casual intercourse between themselves and another person, etc., etc. But like the reality is that I think Bernard has some legitimate feelings or desires for individuality in ways that other people just don't understand, including his boss as well as Helena's friend, and to some degree even Helena, who seems to be a little bit confused by the odd idiosyncrasies that Bernard has during their first couple of encounters. But Bernard has an interesting interaction with his boss that I think is worthy of note. And in addition to that, we're also going to talk about the orgy porgy scene, which is just wacky. So we'll do that right after this first commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We kind of mentioned a couple of interesting scenes that I wanted to talk about specifically that happened in these last few chapters. We kind of learn a little bit about Bernard Marx. I'm pretty sure he's going to be like our main protagonist throughout the rest of the novel. The next couple chapters have been about him. Like I've mentioned in previous episodes, I'm going into this completely blind. I did not read this book as part of like my high school curriculum, which I know a lot of people my age did. And so I've been able to kind of like avoid any spoilers. So, if you have read the book and you're just like, no, this guy's totally off, or how did you not know that already? It's because I just kind of went into it as blind as possible. Just knowing that the basic premise was that this was some form of dystopian novel. And yeah, so the social gatherings that it seems like we've been kind of like perusing as we've been moving through like the tour of the facility and then going back and forth between these like weird rituals of removing the idea of individuality from people. Actually, just real quick as an aside, I have read A Clockwork Orange. I haven't seen the film. I've heard good things, but I haven't seen the film just yet. I've been meaning to watch it. Probably will in the next few weeks because it is on, I think it's on Netflix right now. So either way, I think it's a Kubrick film, which would make it automatically worth watching. But in comparing these two books, they seem pretty similar, which I think is interesting. They both have that kind of like psychedelic, trippy, Pink Floyd-esque type aesthetic going, where there's this like weird machine that kind of is like the Jaws monster. Like you almost never see the whole thing, but like you feel the effects of it throughout the entirety of the book. So in the same way that A Clockwork Orange is kind of like, it doesn't necessarily lay out exactly every detail of the world, like explicitly, but it shows you a ton of detail about the world through the actions of the main characters, and the main characters' interactions with the world. This book is kind of doing a similar thing, but it gets a little bit more into the hard world building. But the reason that I wanted to like kind of compare and contrast those two is because it feels like there's also kind of this linguistic thing that's happening in Brave New World that is similar to the linguistics that happen in Clockwork Orange, because in Clockwork Orange, like most of the book is written in this weird, like futuristic type dialect that is kind of like Newspeak, I guess. It feels like a lot of the dystopian novel authors focus pretty heavily on the interaction of language and society. George Orwell specifically mentions that like Newspeak is part of the way by which the government attempts to control the populace by like shortening interactions and basically kind of making human beings like think about things differently by manipulating their language. Fahrenheit 451 does a similar thing, but focuses on the idea of like books and literature and the language that comes out of those. The Clockwork Orange kind of does a similar thing where it makes casual things that are would normally be considered like detestable, I guess. Like they use the word horror show to describe something as being cool. So I think it's very interesting that the language that people use is so heavily focused on when it comes to these dystopian novels. And I think that that's probably, I would say it's a common theme for multiple reasons. One, because it's kind of easy to reference because it's a common thing that we all experience, interacting with language, figuring out how to talk with people. But we don't often think about how it is that the language that we speak kind of changes the way that we interact with the world. It's hard to put into words exactly like the difference between my perception of the world as someone who learned how to perceive it in the language of English versus someone who would have perceived or learned to perceive the world through the language or the linguistic lens of like Spanish, for instance. They're just words and interactions between people that are described in completely different fashions. So what one word means to me means something completely different to another person, and even if you straight translate between those two things, it's going to be hard to capture exactly or capture everything that happens in that translation. So I think it's worth mentioning also that I don't think there's more than one language that's spoken in Brave New World. I believe that everybody speaks, like common or English, basically. There's a specific mention later of like a bunch of dead languages that the savages speak because, and we'll get to this point in the book, but Bernard and Helena decide to take a vacation to go visit a savage reservation. And they mention specifically that like Spanish is one of the dead languages. And so if I had to guess, there really isn't another language. So the reason that I mentioned the language thing is that there's a lot of terminology that happens in this book that feels very specific to the book, feels very specific to the world that you're in. It's not necessarily as like slang heavy as Clockwork Orange is, but it's much more like technical jargon would be probably the right way to phrase it. Because there are certain things that when they start describing them in detail, it's kind of like, oh, well, this is like a made-up word or a made-up thing that Huxley included to try and convey something about the world that he's in, or the world that we're in. Because it's hard to, describe in full detail using our linguistic understanding and all of the connotations associated with our interactions with language. It's hard to describe something that would be completely outside of the norm, because in Western culture, the idea of the individual is paramount. Free will is paramount. And so for the government of Brave New World to kind of manipulate individuals into giving up their free will by making them part of the collective, but still giving them the perception that they have free will, requires this interesting balance. And like linguistically, we're just going to have a hard time as individuals understanding and living in that world in the same way that Huxley, for instance, would live in that world. So I just found that to be very interesting in general, and worth mentioning. So back to the interesting scenes that happen between that just happened to Bernard, as well as between Bernard and Helena. So the first one that I want to mention is this scene where there's a bunch of chanting, and it's kind of like a religious gathering, but it seems to me that there is no idea of God. Like they view any kind of religious idea as being like intrinsically based in superstition and not based in like faith or reality. They don't view faith as something that is important. I think that part of the reason that Huxley would choose to do this is because one of the main tenets of like Christianity is that you have an individual relationship with God rather than a collective relationship with God. And the individual relationship that you have with God is paramount to your understanding of God. And so it's just kind of interesting to see how things work out in that regard. But overall, I would say that the purpose of this ritual is to kind of show that there is no way to avoid the practice of worship in human life. And I think that's kind of Huxley's main point to this, is that, you know, you can try to eliminate God all you'd like, you can eliminate superstition, you can get rid of all these things, but like ultimately people will just replace them with other things to try and like achieve some sort of enlightenment. And that's what Bernard is kind of seeking when he goes to this, I don't know, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically like a binding, you know. He goes to a group meeting, and at that group meeting everybody sits in this circle that's this pattern of girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, all the way around. So it's cyclical, and they're set up in such a way to where that pattern never ends. So it never goes girl, girl, boy. It's always girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, ad nauseum. And so like even if you were to go around the full circle, then it would, you know, it's kind of like if you could arrange like a set of, put, you know, when you go to queue up the balls in pool, you're supposed to put like stripe, solid. Well, imagine if you could actually get stripe, solid all the way through. So it just cycles around and around. And I think that part of the point of that is that like it's supposed to dehumanize the individuals within it and just kind of turn them into an element of a pattern rather than have them be individuals. So, and that patterned appearance of like not oneness necessarily, but the pattern being repetitive creates this false sense of oneness. And when they are in, or when they start the process of like this ritual, they pass around like a cup or something along those lines. They pass around soma, which is the drug, and they're supposed to, and I'm not entirely sure if the implication is that it is in fact like a group intercourse thing, or if it is just kind of like they're using the word orgy like in like a metaphoric sense, because Huxley doesn't go into explicit detail about whether or not each individual person is like part of like a lewd act with every other individual who's there. But they do mention that like the point is that they all kind of drink soma together and chant these little chants or rituals in unison in order to promote this idea of oneness in a way that is just really kind of like, I guess, off-putting would be the best way to describe it, because it feels very out of place when compared to the scientific approach that everything else has. And I think that that's kind of, you know, Huxley's point, is to introduce these like juxtapositions, these little gaps in the world where, you know, people, they've found ways to manipulate people into forsaking other things that would promote individuality and participating in like groupthink, because instead of it being like, oh, I'm doing this thing, it's like, oh, we are doing this thing. We are doing this ritual that is supposed to bring all of us together. And Bernard Marx is kind of like on the outside of that. He is kind of alien in some regard because he actually has this drive to pursue a sense of self that nobody else seems to have. He has all of these like hidden desires within him to be an individual, whereas everybody else who's there is like excited and elated about the idea of like being part of a like collective. And so I just think it's very interesting that he goes through that particular process and ultimately finds himself feeling even more alone than he did when he started it, because everybody else is like feeling or acting as if they're feeling like they're one with everyone. And Bernard Marx is kind of sitting there like, okay, I'm going through the act of attempting to do this, but I just can't seem to connect. He feels ultimately like very distant from everybody else, simply because of the fact that he doesn't like the feeling that soma gives him. He doesn't like the whole idea of being in that big of a group with everybody all together at the same time. So it definitely is interesting, to say the least. And the religious aspect of this comes in the form of these like odd, almost like Hail Mary like chants that they do, where they'll repeat something that someone has said multiple times. And there are a couple more elements to this particular ritual that I do want to mention, and we'll do that right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We were kind of talking about this weird scene that happens in Brave New World. Almost said Clockwork Orange since we talked about it before the break. But this weird kind of ritualistic scene that happens where one of our main protagonists, Bernard, goes to this odd like group binding session where everybody is supposed to like participate and feel as if they're one with one another, and he ultimately feels unsatisfied with that because he does not feel as if he's like become one with anybody in particular. So it's definitely been interesting to say the least. We have been just kind of like following Bernard's like just lightly following Bernard's journey through the social system of this world. We've been following Helena's a little bit more closely, but I think that's just because Bernard really is not interested in being involved in the social world in any regard. And when he is involved, it generally gets him into more trouble than it's worth for him, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. Because like my perception has generally been that he doesn't really want to participate in the things that his peers want to participate in. And Helena's friend keeps saying that all of his oddities are kind of like can be accredited to the fact that he was exposed to alcohol as a fetus, because the idea of like nature and nurture is kind of I don't want to say non-existent in this world, but it really kind of is. There is no nature versus nurture debate in this particular world because everyone is nurtured in the same way, and the nature is all derivative of like the same set of genes 9 times out of 10. And so they'll kind of use the same set of genes over the course of as many years as possible to get as similar of an outcome as possible, which the fact that there is like kind of this, I don't want to say sinister necessarily, but there's just like this weird kind of behind the scenes thing going on that I just really don't know what to do with. It's hard to think about a world in which like everybody is so bought into these ideas that there is no need for like a totalitarian regime, because even in the interactions that Bernard has with his boss, it doesn't seem as if like there's a hierarchy necessarily. I don't know. It's the world kind of simultaneously makes and doesn't make sense. So like everybody is equally valuable, but not equally valuable in an economic sense, because Bernard makes specific mention of money. And when he's on the vacation that he requests, he thinks about how he left something on in his room or in his hotel room, and it's going to cost him a bunch of money, and so he freaks out about that. So obviously, like, there is a value system ascribed to, like, commodities and services, and it just seems like everybody is kind of, like, placed into their role in that system, and that it's all set. So it's kind of more like a caste system than it is, like, a true egalitarian hierarchy, because not everybody experiences the same level of, like, comfort, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. I'm not entirely sure, because it's odd to think that they would manufacture human beings in such a way that they would ultimately be satisfied with whatever role it is that they're predestined to. But they're not predestined to it by some sort of, like, otherworldly being. They're predestined to it because they were developed in a tank to be predestined to it, which does and doesn't make sense to me. Because part of, I think, Huxley's proposal in writing this book is that you can shape the way that people perceive and interact with the world if you can change their upbringing, and not just their upbringing, but their development. If you can mess with the developmental phase, like the part of their development that occurs in the womb, if you can mess with that, then you can mess with, like, every aspect of their being, which I find very interesting, because it's apropos for what it is that we're kind of, like, looking at as far as science is concerned nowadays. Like, we just had, I think last year, our first instance of gene therapy occurring in utero in China. And so there's worries of, like, designer babies and things like that. So to where, like, people will start picking, I want my child to have blue eyes. I want them to have, be this tall. I want them to do these things. And, like, we're kind of finding out that there is a lot that happens in utero that influences the way that things kind of turn out, which I think it's funny that people have so long denounced horoscopes and astrology as being just kind of like soothsaying, superstitious magic baloney. But the fact of the matter is that, like, those conclusions are going to start, I think those conclusions are going to start correlating more and more with scientific evidence, in ways that people are kind of that people are going to be surprised by. I think it's really interesting that, a lot of, I guess, a lot of science fiction things will often say, like, oh, this is old knowledge that's just been renewed. And, like, that's kind of, in a way, how I think Huxley is approaching the ideas, or some of the ideas in this book, because it feels like some of this is, like, old knowledge. Like, we already knew that you could influence people while they're in the womb, and, like, you could change certain things about them. But imagine if you could do that in a lab. And so now it's not like in womb that you're trying to influence something. It's like you're literally able to observe and watch the development and the way in which things are, or human beings develop proclivities while they're in the womb. So it's like working on this subconscious level that is, like, way beyond what the proposals of, like, 1984, Fahrenheit 451 are. Because in those books, the government doesn't have control over, like, every aspect of human development. They have control over every aspect of, like, I guess mental development would be the best way to phrase it. But in Huxley's book, they literally start at, like, square zero, Like, even the act of a fertilized egg becoming fertilized is a part of the manufacturing process, and every aspect of development is manipulated. So whenever there's an anomaly, one, they can eliminate it, or two, if it does somehow get through, in the case of Bernard, it just becomes something that's like, oh, well, we made a mistake, but, like, this person is within the parameters of what we would consider to be normal, so, we're going to still value them as if they are part of the collective. And it's just kind of odd. But at the same time, there are punishments in place for people who are anomalies, but they're not necessarily hard punishments. So when Bernard goes through a couple of social interactions and ends up just being weird, and people start, like, mentioning how weird he is, his boss says that he's going to have Bernard transferred to Iceland, which I think is a punishment in some way, because Iceland maybe is more isolated than the rest of everything else. But mainly, I think Bernard just doesn't want to have this feeling of, like, failure necessarily, because it seems kind of counterintuitive that he would care where he is if he's ultimately feeling unsatisfied with everything. But I think he also is kind of like a toddler in the way that he wants to test boundaries but doesn't want to have to face the consequences of having tested those boundaries. And something that I think is very interesting is this idea of childhood that is mentioned a couple times. So when Bernard is interacting with his boss, Bernard basically says that, and when he's interacting with Helena, he says that, people are engaging childishly with these adult ideas. So like intercourse is an adult thing that is being engaged in a childish fashion, in a wanton and flagrant fashion. And because intimacy is being treated with such, I don't want to say disdain, but it's just being treated as if it doesn't really matter. Because of that, people are behaving like children. And so I think that something odd that Huxley might be getting at is this idea of like an extended adolescence, in the sense that like nobody has to really think for themselves or draw conclusions for themselves. Everything's kind of laid out in front of them. And if they don't have a solution, then they can just kind of quote a pithy saying to, like a stitch in 9 saves 9. And there are other sayings that Helena says that I can't remember specifically that are basically like, if I am feeling sad, then I'll basically tell myself like, well, if I feel sad, then that's going to make everybody feel sad. So I shouldn't feel sad because I don't want everybody to feel sad. So it's like this weird dichotomy or dichotomous relationship between like the individual and the group, and the individual doesn't really exist, the group exists, but the individual still holds responsibility within the group to fulfill a certain role. And so the individuality of a person comes in the form of like, I am a leaf on a tree, not necessarily I am my own tree. So it's almost like kind of taking human beings and putting them in a full human, like if a human body could be made up of human beings instead of made up of cells. So it's kind of moving the lens of reductionism up a level and saying, what if we stopped it here? And this was how we viewed ourselves, which I think is very interesting. And the fact that Huxley is using the word childish, to me, kind of speaks to a hypothesis that I've kind of been developing, that there is a correlation between the behavior of individuals and their perception of themselves as adults or as children. When you go to domesticate an animal, you select animals that have an elongated pubescent period. So the longer a creature is adolescent, the more likely the more docile it is and easy to control it is. So dogs are essentially just teenage wolves their entire lives. Cows are teenage whatever they originally came from their entire lives. And that's why they're so docile. Sheep, same thing. And so in the same way, humans are kind of domesticating themselves, in my opinion, where the individuals who hold power and influence are realizing, especially in this book, that like, well, the more that we tell people what it is that they have, or what it is that they ought to think, or how it is that they ought to act, then the less adult they will perceive themselves as being, because they'll always be not necessarily slaves to, but beholden to the ideas of a group, and that group is the thing that will take care of them rather than them being responsible for themselves. And like, you see this kind of like pack mentality at work in non-domesticated animals. So wolves do operate in a pack, and the individuals kind of are somewhat responsible for certain like tasks within that pack, but there's no necessarily like guilt associated with failure. It's just kind of like fail or succeed. It's very binary. There's no nuance to it like there is between humans. But when you add in those nuances between humans, now it's like there's like a responsibility that individuals have to participate in this groupthink, participate in this group in general in order to acquire acceptance and love, so that they can feel as if they've been like satiated in some capacity, which I think is very interesting. And I think it's interesting that Huxley is kind of getting at this idea of elongating adolescence in order to create a more docile, domesticated, and compliant populace, which is kind of horrifying in a way, because like the fact is that people are like so unattentive to this happening that they're not even fighting against it, which really just makes me not feel great, I guess would be the best way to phrase that. Because overall, I think that, you know, the freedom of the individual is paramount. And when you remove that freedom and that ability to express oneself, then you end up with a world that I don't think a lot of us would want to live in my opinion. So we're going to take one more quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll finish talking about what's happened in these last few chapters. So we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
So right before the break, we were kind of talking about the ideas presented in the language choice that Huxley made to say, or the linguistic choice that Huxley made to say that people were behaving childishly with adult things, and how that childishness, you know, in some contexts can be viewed as positive, but in other contexts is viewed as easily controlled and therefore is going to be not so positive for us. So I think that we've kind of covered enough of that. I'd like to finish out like talking about the plot a little bit. So where we left off at the end of chapter 6 is that Bernard and Helena have decided to take a vacation. Bernard petitioned for a vacation to go to, I think, New Mexico is where they said they went. But basically in a reservation for savages in the United States. And we haven't actually met the savages just yet, but if I had to guess, the savages are going to have like a relatively modern, like, I guess, lifestyle in some regard. I'm not entirely sure why it is that they get to exist in this brave new world, or in the society in which, like in the world in which Helena and Bernard live, you'd think that they wouldn't have such oddities as individuals who have not bought into the system. And so I'm not entirely sure exactly how it is that these savage societies would still exist. It seems like a place that has the power to manufacture the entire human population of the planet, or at least 90% of the human population of the planet, would not really think it ideal to have these small pockets of individuals who existed so far from, or existed in such a world that is, or in a world that is so far from the world that everybody else exists in. The tourist guide, or the tour guide, specifically mentions like several details about savage life that he's hoping to get a reaction from. It seems like he's kind of like a lonely guy in a weird way, similar to Bernard. I imagine that constantly being on the edge of like a group of people where there's like marriage and all these weird instances of happiness, and then you're like also living in this world where like you're not necessarily valued in a certain way, and like maybe there's a longing to participate in like higher echelons or higher tiers of society, which isn't necessarily mentioned that much just yet, at least. I haven't heard that much mention of someone having like a desire or an ambition to no longer be an epsilon. It seems like they're just fine with being epsilons. And I think that that's part of like the programming that's instilled in them. And even Huxley makes several mentions of the fact that like there is an awareness in the alphas of their subconscious programming to have an aversion to certain behaviors like daydreaming or being attracted to certain things. One thing that I did want to mention that I forgot to mention during that orgy-porgy scene, Bernard is specifically kind of like, I don't want to say made upset by necessarily, but he is hyper-focused on a woman's eyebrows and whether or not they're like satisfactory to him, and he's like judging the physical appearances of women as being like more or less desirable, which I think is interesting because like I don't think the point is aesthetics in this world in any regard. It's also interesting because, you know, Huxley, like that being like a primary judgment of value or of worth in those particular interactions is not necessarily the most favorable portrayal of I guess males or females in that particular instance. But I understand the point of him including it in the novel, and I think that it's, you know, it's just interesting to point out the ways that people perceive the world. I'm not necessarily trying to ascribe a value statement to whether or not he should have done something else or anything like that, just observing. But overall, the general consensus is that, you know, like where you are is where you're supposed to be, which is a good viewpoint, except for there's no advancing past where you are supposed to be. It's just kind of like you are where you are, and that's just the result of your existence. And so to have these people who have these cultures of like monogamy, of natural reproduction, of individuality, of possession, I think is going to be like it just seems weird that they would exist in this world. So I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen to Bernard and Helena and while they're on this vacation. There is specific mention that like once you're in a reservation, you can't get out. A reservation. Yeah, I guess it is called a savage reservation, which I am sure that Huxley selected that wording for a very precise reason, and I doubt that it is a positive one. I'm sure that he's trying to make a commentary there. But the tour guide specifically mentions that the fences that surround these savage reservations are like they'll kill you instantly upon like when you touch them. And so, you know, I think it's interesting that the savages are not allowed to assimilate into the world around them. Like even if a child of a savage were to be like, oh, I want to go live in like society with the rest of people, like it seems like even their mobility, even their purpose in some ways manipulated to be fixed rather than be mobile. So apparently at the end of chapter 6, you know, they're given a guide and it's going to be this little boy who is a quote unquote savage. And I guess there's they're lacking in a lot of amenities as far as like heating and air, visual amenities, drugs, things like that. Though I do think it's interesting, Helena seems to be convincing Bernard pretty frequently to take more soma, which I'm interested to see how that's going to like play itself out. I'm not entirely sure what exactly it is that soma does specifically. Huxley's been pretty vague as to the properties of the drug. It just seems like it's kind of like a general, like an emotional tranquilizer would be the best way to phrase it. It basically takes your emotional response and dulls it down to something that is more tolerable, I guess, for lack of another word. Which, you know, is generally bad. Especially in the general sense of like what it is ideal for like individuals. But in this particular world, it's ideal for individuals to feel less, because if they feel less, they're less likely to have like other desires and things like that. So, I'm not entirely sure where it's going to go from here. If I had to guess, and again, I'm going into this completely blind, so you guys, just part of the fun of this particular series is if you've read the book, you can kind of just laugh at me for my silly predictions. I think that they're going to get trapped on the reservation somehow, or they're going to choose to stay on the reservation, and that's going to be part of the conflict, or that like Bernard is going to ultimately find something on the reservation that he feels the need to share with everybody, and he's going to have to try to convince people of it. I am pretty sure that Bernard and Helena end up like falling in love, quote unquote, and deciding that they only want to be with each other. And so there's like this this approach of like a singular possession of the person that they're with in juxtaposition to a world where everybody is everyone's possession. So I'm interested to see how that's going to play itself out. But at the end or towards the end of the chapter, we find out that Bernard is in fact going to be transferred to Iceland, and that his boss is looking for a replacement for him, which I think is interesting because like the fact that you can move people around in the society where you're just kind of destined to do what it is that you're supposed to do seems a little odd. Like it's almost like every chair should have a person in it, and that person is there until they die. And like, yeah, it's just kind of odd. But I will say what's interesting is that the comparison or the animal anthropomorphic comparison that is made about Bernard is that he's kind of like a rhinoceros, which I'm not entirely sure what the association with rhinoceroses would have been in the late 1920s or the early 1930s when I think this book was published. If I had to guess, they're still endangered. They're rare, but they're also kind of like this anomaly, this like majestically hideous anomaly, because like rhinoceroses aren't really a beautiful creature. They're like short and pudgy and like kind of built like an ugly small tree trunk. Like they look like a tree. They look similar in fashion to a tree that grows in the environment that they live in. But they're kind of associated with like stubbornness or bullheadedness, but in a way that like is more wild than like a cow or a bull. So I think that Huxley makes that comparison to specifically say that like it's not as if Huxley is a bull. It's more as if Huxley is this like oddity, this stubborn oddity that exists in unique contrast to everybody else and is kind of allowed to exist because of its uniqueness, because of the oddity of it. It's kind of like going to, in the early 19th century, they did the like shows where they would have individuals who like women who had beards or people who were just generally way taller than that they were used to back then. Just like all of these like oddities, right? Based in like the human appearance of oddities. And in my opinion, there's kind of some foreshadowing of like the fact that Marx or Bernard is allowed to exist because of the fact that he represents such like an oddity or a spectacle, and that it's not that necessarily he is really as rebellious or as odd as he thinks that he is. I would wager to guess that he is going to kind of serve the overall government as a way to kind of like expose other individuals who might share or who might sympathize with him and his particular conflicts with the world around him, and that's going to he's kind of like a planted. He's kind of like a narc, but doesn't know that he's a narc. But that's generally, I don't know exactly if that's enough. If that one statement is enough to foreshadow the entire rest of the book on. But the important part is that, we're finding out that Bernard is going to suffer the consequences of his oddity or of his weirdness. And he kind of expresses that he didn't think that was ever going to happen. Like the first time that we see him interact with his boss, and his boss is like, hey, if you don't shape up, I'm going to ship you out to Iceland. He says like, oh, nobody ever actually gets sent to Iceland. Like that never happens. Like this is just an empty threat. And so for the fact that this threat is kind of like being brought into fruition, to me kind of indicates something like kind of deeper going along behind the scenes here. We haven't really had any interaction with the government of this world, just with like the production facilities of it and kind of like the social gatherings of it. So we don't really know exactly like the depths of the oppression that are occurring here. The way that it's posited at the beginning of the book, it almost feels like it's been so long since people lived in another way that they've grown accustomed to this particular way of living. So now it's the new normal. So there doesn't need to be like an authoritarian regime to carry it out. But I think that part of Huxley's point might be that like people just aren't going to be that easily subdued. So you would always need some sort of system to hold individuals to the law that it is that you're trying to promote. So we'll see exactly where that goes next week. That's all I've got for you guys this week. I'm excited to keep reading this book. Like I said, I am hesitantly optimistic that I am still going to absolutely love it. So if you guys like the podcast, make sure to subscribe, give us a like, leave us a 5-star review. We would love that. Follow us on any social media platform. Just search GSMC Podcast Network or GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. And, yeah, if you're in California or Oregon, make sure you're staying safe. I know that, like, a lot of the state has had to be evacuated. People are having power outages pretty regularly. So, you know, I'm crossing my fingers for everybody involved that things are going to go well and that people can, you know, stay safe. Definitely is a weird time. So stay safe out there. Thank you to all of our first responders. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you again on Sunday.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.